Okay, so I should be sharing my screen, and now the recording start. So I was hoping to post a recording earlier in the week, and I was going to use the ones from the Health IT National Curriculum because there's a module in there for workflow analysis and process redesign. And when I looked at it, it was way too centric. Okay, Ali, Sharab and Miriam can hear okay. Can you check and make sure that your microphone and speakers are on? Okay, it looks like he's reconnecting. There we go. Okay, so hopefully when he reconnects, he'll be okay. Okay, so when I looked at that content, it was very specific for working in a clinic setting, and it didn't have some of the more general information about conventions and sort of the formalism. So I decided to drop back and punt and have a broader discussion of it because I wanted to go over the data flow too. So I just sort of held that topic for today. So we're going to have we're going to do workflow and data flow today in this one class. I need to the reading for it was posted in a different week, so I need to move that for you guys. But Sally, I just put the slides up. If you're one of the ones that likes to follow along, there I just put them up. Okay, so I'm going to jump in. Earlier in the semester, we did conceptual diagrams in which we talked a little bit about how to make your diagrams communicate things most clearly by having the only visual distinction on the diagram be a distinction that is intended on communicating something. When that concept applies completely here. We also talked when we did the UML topic, or Unified Modeling Language, we also talked about activity diagrams. Those are similar to flow diagrams. They generally show the same thing. Both can be multi-lanes, which we'll talk about a little earlier. A little later in the lecture. But the really only difference between the UML activity diagrams and the flow diagrams that we'll talk about today for process is the notation and the formalism. And that is really important. So that's what we're going over today, process and data flow. There are two other things that I wanted to bring up. The first is that we're making a transition in our syllabus from talking about knowledge of facts to more procedural based knowledge. And so there's generally in knowledge management and knowledge acquisition, people generally make a distinction between two different types of knowledge. And those are declarative knowledge, meaning knowledge of facts, versus procedural knowledge, which is sort of how to do something or logic about doing something. So if you look at data that are in a database, those values in the database, that's declarative knowledge. By virtue of being in the database, it's stating some fact. Might be true, might not be true, but it's stating some fact. When we look at an ontology or a taxonomy, a tree structure with relationships is a part of, component of, contraindicates. Those are facts. So those are all declarative knowledge structures. But that's not the only type of knowledge that we need when we practice in informatics, whether it's in a basic science lab or whether it's working with disease surveillance and population health. We also care about knowledge of process, especially inside a lab or inside a clinical environment. We care very dearly about the process, and so we're going to talk today about how to manage that. So now I'm going to go to the full slide mode. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about two types of flow charts. One we're just kind of refer to that we covered earlier. We're going to talk about ISO flow charts. ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. When something is made a standard in any one country, the standards flow up through the country representative to ISO to become an international standard. There's a very old ISO standard. Hang on, let me exit out. Looks like my slides are advancing automatically. There's a very old ISO standard called ISO 5807. And ISO 5807 is the standard for representing flow control, so workflow or process. Although when it was created, it was just for data processing. And so if you look at in the quality improvement side, you'll see folks using flowcharts. Those standard symbols have their roots back in the old ISO 5807 standard. So that's when I say ISO-Duran flowcharts, that's what I mean. ISO being the origin of those symbols. UML activity diagrams we talked about earlier, but I do have a few slides in here in case we need to disambiguate some of the formalism between the two, because the formalism is important. We're going to talk about process flow versus data flow, and a little bit at the end about something called business process modeling notation, or BPMN, and moving from diagramming a process to being able to use a computer to simulate a process. For example, flow through a public health department with the lines and the queuing and how to make that work. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So here's our learning objectives. And basically we teach this class at the conceptual level because it's so daggone broad. You would end up working 50 hours a week if we took you into the detail of each of the topics. This is one of the topics where we want you to be able to come out with the ability to draw one of these diagrams, meaning read a paragraph or observe a process and draw the appropriate diagram. So this is one of the few areas in the class where we actually dive down into skills development. And so one thing I'll say that we mentioned with UML is that the UML formalism over here, that's the column with all the X's, Unified Modeling Language was really built out of a lot of predecessor formalisms for diagramming both process flow and data flow and other aspects of information that a programmer needed to know when they were developing a new information system. So one of those predecessors is the old ISO 5807 standard. Next are two formalisms. One is called Jordan and the other is called Gaines-Sarson. They're just different notations for some of the similar concepts. UML then is the evolution of all of those things together. So UML is the current standard, which is why we sort of went over it earlier. Because if a business analyst is working to make specifications for designing or changing a system, then UML is most likely what they'll be using to document that. And the last is the entity relationship diagrams, or the crow's foot notation for relational databases that we talked about earlier when we talked about databases. And so I put them all up here on one slide so that, that you can see what it is we're trying to represent in the diagram and which of the formalisms do that well. So the process aspects that you might want to represent are the context in which an information system is going to exist, meaning what's in the system versus what's in the environment external to that system. We might want to represent process steps in a process. So like if we were going to write a standard operating procedure, all of our SOPs here, and at least on the data management side, have process flow diagrams attached to them. So there's not just text that says do this, then you do this, then you do this. There's an actual explicit flow diagram so that people can see on one page what the steps in that process are. There are also data flow steps that we might want to represent. And it's really, really important. Probably the worst and most common mistake I ever see on process flow diagrams are folks that try to represent the data flow and the process flow on the same daggone diagram. And it makes, because you're conflating those two concepts together, you don't get an explicit or clean representation of either one of them, which is why there are two separate diagrams for those two separate things. And then the next is representing information content. And so far we've seen two ways to do that, a UML class model, as well as the entity relationship diagram that we looked at for relational databases. The next item that we might want to show is data transformation. In other words, what operations are we performing on data? Are we imputing in values that were blank? Are we coding data with a standard control terminology? Are we deriving values? For example, are we calculating body mass index from height and weight? Any of those operations performed on data are data transformation, or maybe we're just mapping data to a common data model, like we talked about earlier in the common data model lecture. The next thing that we might want to represent is flow control and state. In UML, we did the state diagram, so you guys got a pretty good handle on that. Those looked really good on that lab. And flow control means decisions. You know, for example, if you look at the acute care guidelines for acute coronary syndromes, there's a decision about whether the hospital has a cath lab or not. If the hospital has a cath lab, then they go ahead and treat them and do the intervention there. If the hospital doesn't have a cath lab, then after that decision, if the answer to that decision is no, then they medically stabilize the patient and then transfer them to a hospital with a cath lab. And so that's what we mean by flow control and state. Flow control is what steps come before other steps, what steps come after, and what tells you which path to take in the process. And then the last thing that we might want to represent are the roles involved. And you guys did those when you did the use case diagrams in UML, because you represented each of the roles and then actions or functions that they needed to do in the system. So these process aspects are the things that that generally have evolved over the practice of the last 30 or 40 years of designing and developing information systems that need to be represented in specs for those systems. Make sense? Everybody good? Okay. So we talked about in UML, we had these three types of diagrams, structure, behavior, and interaction diagrams. Remember that the activity diagram in UML was a behavior diagram, and the activity diagram is analogous in that it shows the process steps and the flow control of the process steps in the same way that an ISO 5807 flow chart is that we're going to talk about now. So a flow chart is just a graphical representation or depiction of steps that occur in some process, any process. The ISO standard is the one that specifies it. And the important thing to know here is that because it's a graphical depiction, the symbols are important. So like if the standard symbol for a decision is a diamond, like you can't use a square. You'll flunk if you use a square. Because by virtue of using a diamond, you're communicating that there's a decision that occurs there and that there's two outflows. So the shape, the type of shape that you use to represent stuff is key when you're diagramming processes. And using the wrong shape means that you don't understand that the goal of what you're trying to do is communicate something graphically. So thus, the flow charts, whether they're representing a data flow or a workflow, here when you use the term flow chart, generally the connotation is that you're talking about a process flow rather than data flow. Flow charts are constructed from the standard symbols, and that there's also connectors between the symbols that facilitate editing the flow chart, and also, remember I showed some, but I can show them again. Also show which direction the flow is on the flow chart. So the standard flowchart symbols are these ones. The parallel lines with curves connecting them, not an oval, but I'm not even sure it has a name, but that thing is a terminal symbol. And in a flowchart, the terminal symbol is where you start and where you stop. In an activity diagram, do you remember what the terminal symbol was? What shape? Yes, it was a circle, exactly. And so here you'll notice in this formalism, circle means something like completely different. So don't mix them up. And so terminal symbols, so how you get into your flow chart, where you start, is a terminal symbol. So if it's a doctor's office visit, The start might be patient shows up for visit in your process. That would be the terminal symbol. After the visit's done, patient's happy, has his prescription and goes home. That would be a terminal symbol, any exit from the process. Tasks that are done by humans or machines in the process are just regular rectangles. There's another symbol for a standard process that we'll go over that's in a little add to that. Decisions in 5807 are represented as a diamond, and documents are represented as the rectangle with the exception with a wavy line on the bottom, meaning like a piece of paper, like it's torn off at the bottom. And so what decisions are pretty self-explanatory. It's flow control for the process. It's places in the process where, depending on the answer to some question, you could go one way or you could go another way. Document is something on a paper, a report, or some other information on a document that's coming into or going out of the process. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a paper, but the connotation of a document in information systems is something that generally all rides together and requires a signature on it. In other words, for example, there's this thing called the continuity of care document. It's basically if you go out for a consult, say your pediatrician or sends your kid out for a dentist consult because not all of the teeth are showing up like they're supposed to. So then after the dentist sees the kid, then the dentist is going to write a thing back to the primary care physician that says, well, I looked at the kid and we did some tooth x-rays. I'm sure there's a more formal name for that. And they're there and everything's normal. It's okay. So that document, that back would be what the dentist would write up, would sign as their formal consult that they would send back to the pediatrician. So things that are managed like that are documents, as opposed to individual pieces of data that move around. So, for example, if somebody goes to the lab and there's they order a urinalysis, hematology, and clinical chemistry. The clinical chemistry results are done first. They bing show up in the electronic health record from the lab information system. Not a document, just data values. They may have a date and time associated with them, but by virtue of being run on different analyzers and available at different points in time, they don't all have to ride together necessarily. So there's a distinction between a document and other data. There are also lines in flowcharts. There are no curved lines in flowcharts, and the lines represent the direction of the process flow in a flowchart. And then the last thing is a connector. Generally on flowcharts, you really want to be able to diagram the process on a page or two. A 30-page flowchart is really not going to help anybody. And so, but when you do have the need to go from one page to the other, you use this thing called a connector, and you put numbers in them. And so the circle with a connector 1 on it would meet up with a circle with the same number 1 in it on a different page to show that they connect. And we'll show examples of all these and walk through them. So this is an example of the terminator symbol. For a doctor's office visit, say the patient arrives, he comes to the office for a scheduled visit, he goes to the front desk, he wants to sign in. The front desk might do some other things associated with that, like confirm insurance, arrive them in the system, or mark that they showed up, and maybe they'll confirm their contact information. So the start of that process being patient arrives makes that need a terminating symbol. Basic process symbols, we had some in the last slide, but we have them here too. So steps in the process that are done by humans or machines are shown, like signing in at the front desk, marking the patient arrived, confirming insurance, pulling a chart, escorting into the exam room. All of those are tasks or steps in the process that are done. So in other words, they should begin with a verb in the box. The next one is decision. This one I think we pulled out of the tuberculosis domain analysis model. A decision, they call it flow control because the path that you take in the flow chart depends on the answer to the decision. Just like it would if you learned flow charts for computer programming. It's the same exact concept. So here they do a drug susceptibility test, and what grows out in the culture is either, or say yes, it's TB, so it's actually, it's a drug for the mycobacteria. So if it's susceptible, then they give them the standard prescription. If it's not susceptible, they give them an alternate prescription for the drug. And then after that, they either begin or change the treatment for the patient. So by virtue of having that decision there, you're showing that there's different paths, different steps that occur based on the answer to that decision. Does that make sense? Okay. A lot of people use incorrect symbols on the flow charts. I think I just pulled this one off the web. I found that on Wikipedia. So here, what's wrong with this flow chart? What symbols are wrong? There's a lot of things wrong with it, but okay, so the first one's not a terminal symbol, right? The last one is not a terminal symbol. These other green things to the side, which are the same box shape that's used for the terminal symbol, also seem to be used as a task box, but they're not. The official ISO 87 task box has hard corners, not rounded corners. So those are wrong as well. Yeah.
So since they're considered, I mean, binding link would also be an action too. So what's specified between binding link and that terminal action other than position versus replacing the goal?
Sure. So on this particular flow chart, because that ends there, like it's sort of the end thing, that would be a terminal symbol. These, it's kind of hard to tell the way they've got it drawn because if it's a task, a process, then it needs to lead to something. Process boxes are not black holes. So we'll go over some of those rules that might help with that. So a process box, it has to, something has to happen as a result of that process, and what happens as a result is what comes out the other end. So that sort of tells you it's a terminal or it's not. But thanks for the question. The other thing here are the colors on flowcharts. So unless color is communicating some new information that is not otherwise depicted on there, do not shade the boxes. It is bad. Okay, so for those of you that are following along, if I pull the screen up, I think this will go away. So I might just have to read it. But let's read through the scenario. I'll give everybody a few minutes to read through the scenario or pull up the slides separate. Okay, so then the first thing I do if I'm going to draw a flow chart of this, I generally just start drawing. But if you're not used to doing them, it will help if you list out the actual steps that the paragraph is trying to convey. Because the skill of being able to draw a flow chart is the skill of hearing somebody tell you something or getting a written document or observing a process in some lab or clinical setting and being able to represent it explicitly and graphically. So a good first step is just to write out the individual tasks. And so I'm going to try to make the screen go up. Oh, good. We can sort of keep it. Okay. Okay, so for you guys online, I'm going to draw this flow chart out. I'm going to move the mic over as far as I can to where I'm going to be standing. If just make it ding if you can't hear me, and then I will repeat whatever it was that I said. Okay, so the first step in the process, the patient arrives at the clinic, signs in, checks in at the front desk. So what will we draw for that? Let's see. Yeah, the pill, the terminal symbol. Okay, so that. So arrives. Patient. Okay, so we have the terminal symbol as this patient arrives. So then the next step is they sign in and they check in at the front desk. So I'm going to just, so what box would convey signing in and or checking in at the front desk? Progress? Yep. Okay, so we'll do sign in. And then we'll do checking in. And then what happens next? So then the receptionist enters the patient into the visit system and confirms contact information. Okay, so what we're seeing is after these two things happen, which could happen kind of in parallel, then the reception enters them and confirms insurance. So depending on the detail level, we might put both of them, enters in, we'll say, in EHR, although it didn't say that, and confirms. But since these were in the same sentence, that's kind of telling you without something that says one happened after the other or before the other, that's kind of telling you they happened at the same time. So we can either put them in the same box or we could put them like this. So this both contains the same thing. These two different ways of doing it. And then, so then what's the next one? The nurse interviews the patient regarding signs and symptoms and complaints and records into the nurse's progress notes. Oh, wait, I forgot pulling the chart. Okay, so we forgot number 3. The nurse pulls the chart and puts the patient in the exam room. So, is everybody good with this? Okay, I'm going to erase this. I forgot to add the erasers in here. Okay, so then we would have, so I could use a connector. If this was on multiple pages, I'd put a 1 there and a 1 here. So full chart. And I had it in the same sentence, so I'll say it happened at the same time. And escorts, oh, thank you, to room. Okay, then there's the interview. So what would we use for the interview? Press and spots, yep. Interview. And what else do they do in the interview? Or they do the progress note. So progress note. Again, I put it in the same sentence, so it could have, unless I say then. Did I put then up there? Nope. Okay, so then it's parallel if there's no sequence. Then the next one says takes and records vital signs, and it says the patient's ready. So what kind of symbol am I using for that? Process box. Okay. So takes vital signs, and then bottom one, notify physician. Okay, so then we'll, at number 6, which one would that be? What shape would number 6 be? Yeah. So we'll, if this was a piece of paper, this would be number 2. Okay, so we do the exam and the charting. And then physician determines if a prescription, procedure, or lab work is required and completes the necessary paperwork. So what's that one? It's a decision, yeah. And you could put 2 decisions in there. One is if these are required. Oh, no, just one. Unless you want to do a decision for all, but I would probably do them for these and just put order. Because all those would be in order. For something, so if an order is required, then I'm going to make it yes and no. So the important thing about decision is all of the outflows have to be labeled because it's got to be explicit. So then let's see, if it's required, then there's some paperwork completed. So what would that be? So review process. So let's draw that part of it. So we order. And the result of that might be what? Say it's a prescription. Yes, document. So some kind of document will come out. So, okay, so we got that. Then step 8 provides any additional instructions to the patient. Okay, so then after this, there's going to be the provide instructions would be process. So provide instructions. And then you might have what coming out of that? Some instructions, exactly. And then let's see what else. Provides instructions and concludes the visit. Okay, so then this no, we can't leave it hanging, right? So if there's no order, there still could be instructions. So we probably connect back with, follow up with the process there. So this part here would only be done if an order were required. And then if we continue over here, after the instructions box, so the physician provides a chart to the office staff.
Is the left side of the diagram of the dot, is that supposed to be
Yeah.
And then on the far left side, it looks like it's 2 at the bottom left, where we got the complete order of the dot, and then the instructions go to the patient.
It's another document. Because it would usually be discharge instructions for patient education material. So I'm sorry, it's a little sloppily drawn. And so then it would come the instructions, after the instructions, the physician provides the chart to be filed. You might draw a thing on there for filing the chart. And then the patient pays. So that will be what? Well, you could say pays and leaves, or you could say pays and then leaves for the operator, but yes. So we'll just say pays and leaves. So you guys kind of get the hang of it? Okay. So if we look at that example, I did one in the slide for it. And so there's not one way always to do these, but so to test you on them, I'll have to make the words be as exact as possible so that, we won't have 2 possible right answers. There should not be 2 possible right answers in there. But this is pretty much, except did we do the order? No, we didn't do the order on there. We just did to to notify provider that patient's ready. So this was just our first part of it. So another example is, this was something that we were working with for doing the acute coronary syndromes data standards. And in these ones, there's a lot of different decisions, obviously, in caring for a patient with acute coronary syndromes. And so each of those decision boxes made those decisions. This was part of a much larger diagram where the peach was inpatient part of the hospitalization. Another color was ED, another color was the cath lab, so we kind of differentiated them that way. Just another example of a decision. So the next type, we talked about the document box. Some softwares have multiple document thing that you can use like this. Others just have one document shape. It really doesn't matter. If it's a multiple thing like a patient chart, you might want to show one with multiple documents to communicate that it's more than just a single thing. The next symbol that we really don't use this symbol a lot. I put it in here just so you might, just because you might see it. It looks like this, the funny thing that says form for patient visit appears. It's a shape with a curved front, kind of like an eyeball. And it's made to, you know, the old computer terminals that had the curved glass and then the big thing bubble out the back. That's what the shape is supposed to, that's where the shape came from. So if you're putting something on a visual display, a computer screen, for somebody to read, you would generally use the display box for that. So this is an example of the connector box. Here I showed 2 pages and how the connectors would look. And that just logically helps the human make the connection when you have a flow chart that has to go on multiple pages. And then there are some other symbols that I'm going to go through that are kind of obscure, and they're not used a lot. The one on top with the diagonal line. Oh, screen. Sorry, I'm so sorry, guys. Why didn't y'all say something? So the symbol on top with the diagonal line means a manual input. So in other words, if you have a registration clerk entering the patient's insurance information in, it would, according to the ISO 5807 standard, it would be most correct to use this exact symbol rather than a process box. Although this, by definition, is a process, so if you used a process box, we couldn't really count it wrong. You would just be communicating more detail level information about the type of task that was being done. And the one at the bottom with the parallel lines on the top and bottom and the 2 diagonal lines on the side, that represents any manual operation. So it's anything that's performed by humans. So again, you could use this for data entry, manual data entry. You could also use it for a human packing a box before they ship it somewhere, or a patient transporter taking a patient from the ED up to a room. So this is an example. So there's a billing form arrives at the receptionist, and the receptionist locates the patient in the system for a manual process. Then there's key entry of the patient form, which is manual data entry, and that key entry is done on the form that appears on the computer screen. And the actual claim form is the input into that. So that's how you might use some of those. I rarely use these other symbols. It's mainly on the earlier slide with just a few symbols on it. Those are really the main ones that people use today. Here's some other of the old ones. The slanted box is sort of any unspecified data. So if you're specifying a data transfer and you don't know it's coming, if it's coming on old ancient tapes, or if it's coming on a thumb drive or a CD or some electronic mechanism link, then you just might use a generic data box. There's the data storage symbol is the can, looks like a database. That's sort of been flipped on its edge and used differently today. When you see something that looks like a tuna can in a diagram, it's the use of this symbol, and they're using it to mean storage, data storage in some database. So if we, just this example flow chart, so we might log the patient into the system. Then we might collect some data during a visit. There might be a record that's picked up from a referring physician, by some electronic data transfer is what that loop on the side tells us. Then back to the main flow. After the data are collected during the patient visit, then the entry operator might locate the patient in a system. There might be manual key entry, and that data would be then stored in a database. Is sort of how you'd read it, and that will correspond. There are two ways to communicate delay in a process diagram. If you're just drawing data collection processes, sometimes a delay might be important. For example, if you're doing a research study, your study gets data from the data warehouse. The data warehouse only puts new data in weekly. Then you might want to represent the delay in that data coming to you by a delay symbol. And so another delay would be, for example, National Death Index stuff like that comes maybe 6 month delay or something like that. So sometimes delays are very impactful into how you perceive a process and the currency of data in it. So the first type of delay is the bullet symbol, and it really kind of comes from the old AND gate. When Dr. Tarbox was talking, he showed some AND gates and OR gates and whatever. So a delay, basically, because an AND gate has 2 inputs and 1 output on it, for a delay to happen, there are multiple things that have to come into the back of it, and you can only proceed in the process until all of those things have arrived or completed, which is why they use that symbol. There's another convention in the 5807 formalism, and that's using 2 parallel lines for a delay. So here on the bottom snippet diagram, so until A is finished, C and D and E cannot happen. And importantly, F cannot happen until B, C, and D have all 3 finished, is what that communicates. So where timing and things are being completed at different times, and timing is important to forward progress, then you may need to be able to diagram delays. And so either of those. If I have more than 2 inputs, I usually use the bottom one. If I just have 2 inputs, it's more efficient graphically sometimes just to use an AND gate notation. But because you use standard symbols and formalism, anybody else that also knows the standard understands very explicitly what you're communicating with it. So there are also some non-symbol standards. The first is using text descriptions. The other is a detail level of diagram, flow direction, and lines. So for text descriptions, they're generally done using annotations, or call-outs, which I don't have one drawn here, but basically it's just a caption with a pointer to the box. So for easy viewing of the diagrams, you don't want to put too many words in the boxes. If you've got like 10 or 30 words in the box, like that is way too many. So you would normally use a call out off to the side to put some of that detail. So then if sometimes you run into a situation where a call out or a textual explanation might refer to more than one step in a process, then you can draw a line around it. So like if I was working with the implementation of a system in an office setting, and there was a data system that was used that hadn't been built yet, but that I was going to have some functionality for somebody to look up a customer, enter information about the customer, and generate a bill. And then I might put a dotted line around all those 3 steps and a call out that says new functionality not added yet, or something like that. The next issue is detail level. So when you draw a process, all of the things on the flow diagram need to be at the same level of detail. That is of critical importance. It's another one of the really, really common mistakes that I see people make when they do flow diagrams, is they'll do something like this. They'll have the bottom version. So if you'll note on the top version, everything up there on that top one is pretty much at the same level of detail. We're going to identify some data to be collected. We're going to define it. We're going to measure something. We're going to record the data. We're going to process it. We're going to analyze it. And at the last two steps, we generate reports. But instead, if somebody draws this long, detailed, multi-step thing for how we're going to process data, that the detail, all those loops under the process data, are fundamentally, they're at a much lower level of detail than the other process box in the diagram. So it makes your diagram seem sort of unprofessional, and it confuses people when there are boxes on the diagram that are at different levels of detail. So you want to try to keep all the boxes at the same level of detail as possible. In doing that, sometimes you end up with multi-level diagrams where you might have a cover sheet that might have just the stuff on the top, and then you would have a second page if there's a very detailed data processing stuff. You might have a very detailed page that lists the details of the data processing, or has the flow chart for the details of the data processing. Does that make sense? Okay. The other common mistake that a lot of people make is they screw up the flow direction on the flow chart, which is, if somebody does those kind of things, you're like, oh my God, they have no idea what they're doing. So forward direction in the process should all be at the same direction on the flow diagram. So, in other words, this one here where there's, on the left-hand side, looks like inclusion, exclusion criterion, for a study. So the first decision is the patient older than 18? If yes, then they complete a 2-week washout. And here it says, if yes, we enroll them off to the side, and if no, they're not eligible. So you see that forward progress would be to put enroll under the washout decision. And you see kind of when you're reading it how that makes a lot more sense when you read it. So if you always want to make sure that forward progress is either top to bottom or left to right, and then backward process like rework, like if you detect an error and you have to go back and correct the error, then that would go in the reverse direction, because it's rework in a process, be in a reverse direction for flow that progresses the process further along. So you always want to keep your flow going in the right direction on the diagrams. Yeah, so it is better if they're on the same side. But you will run into some situations where, like, graphically on the page, you've got a big loop over here and you can't do it. So what competes with that is that you don't want your lines to cross. Although some of the software will do a little hitch in the line so that when you cross lines, it's not ambiguous. It shows that this line, that these aren't intersecting or combining flow directions. It's this line just goes over this one on the sheet of paper. So it competes with that. So if your software will allow you to do that, to keep the nose on the one side, then great. If your software won't allow you to do that, and your choice is put one no on the right and another no on the left versus have lines cross and be ambiguous, put one no on the right and one no on the left. So there are trade-offs with it. Thanks for the question. Any other questions while we're here? Okay. So the next one is diagonal and curved lines. Flow chart in the ISO 5807 standard, there are no diagonal lines, there are no curved lines. If you do a flow chart and you're putting diagonal lines and curved lines in it, it looks unprofessional if you do that. And because people tend to have some curved lines, some diagonal lines, and it's not as clean and crisp, and it doesn't clearly communicate often what's intended to be communicating. So it could be, what it communicates is kind of fuzziness of thinking, and that's never what you really want to communicate. So instead of doing the one on the left, you would in rather draw it is the one on the right. In the 5807 standard, there are different kind of lines. So the solid line is just the normal process flow, and you put arrowheads on the line to denote the direction of the process flow. A dashed line can show an alternate path. Sometimes in a complex situation, you might have an alternate path. Like if you're, like you may have some patients that come in through normal stuff like referrals and whatever, and they go through check-in and are handled one way. You might have other patients who are incarcerated who come in, and they might go through a different, more secure intake process. So that might be an alternate path for a different type of individual or a different type of sample. If you're in a lab, you may have some samples that are sort of hazmat grade samples. Those probably have an alternate path into the lab and handling in the lab. So you can show it that way. The jagged line represents a telecommunication link. I don't see that a lot. That's more sort of older formalism in the standard. But I put it here because it is, people still use it, some people. And then the parallel lines to denote a delay in the process. So those are the variations of lines you might see. You guys good? Okay. So just to refresh everybody's memory, the symbols are different. The only one that's really the same are the lines with the arrows on them and the diamonds. In the activity diagram, the tasks are shown as activities that are like terminal symbol in the ISO 5807 formalism, and the connectors are in what's a connector in a 5807 is a start or an end in the UML activity diagram. The decision boxes are the same. And the branch points, I actually like the way UML does branch points better because decision boxes take up a lot of space on a diagram. Because just to prevent from distracting communicating your message, you want the boxes the same size. So like if you have a process box, all the process boxes need to be the same size. You shouldn't have big process box, then a little one, then a big one, then a little one. It looks very unprofessional. So for the decisions, when you make a box to have the words in it the way that the softwares normally do it, they end up taking up a lot of real estate. So the activity diagram actually like the way it does that better. And so an activity diagram, I think this is the example or similar to it that we used last time when we talked about it, but that just to show how different it looks. And then here's one. This was done doing using Enterprise Architect, a modeling system. So that's how they implement the branches and the decision and the start and stop and the activity boxes in there. That's just another example. So does anybody have any questions on process flowcharts, 5807 flowcharts? Okay, so the primary areas where you would use a process flowchart in the research setting, when if you're managing data for a study, you're going to do a data management plan. First step always in the data management plan is to identify your data sources and your kind of overall process and keep that updated. So those are diagrams used a lot in that setting. They're also used, process flows are used a lot in workflow analysis and process redesign, both in lab or clinical settings, because you want to diagram the process as it currently is today to make sure everybody understands the same thing, so you know what you're going to change, and then you would design the new process that you hope to be in the future. And you would use the diagram to look for some very specific things on there, like inefficiency or waste or delays or things like that. And so the diagrams, if you use them correctly, can be a tool in doing that. So those are and the other is in software design, because you want to communicate the processes around what the users are doing with the system and how the system is being used in some clinical or lab or whatever kind of setting. So now I'm going to switch to data flow, because the process diagrams show tasks done by humans or machines, steps in a process. Data flow shows movement of data, which sometimes can correspond to steps in a process, but there are usually always things about the data, like operations performed on the data, that you would not show in a workflow step. And so the first, was that a ding? Okay. Oh, that was you. Okay. Okay. All right. So a data flow diagram. This uses old Jordan syntax. There's really not an equivalent of a data flow diagram in UML, which is very sad because it perpetuates people conflating data flow and workflow, which is can get you into real big trouble if you're designing a system or communicating as a user or a representative of some users what the flow needs to be. And so the data flow diagrams show movement of data, not necessarily process. We're going to use the Jordan notation. There's also there's a book online. It's free. It's open source. It's an older book because this is most definitely an older notation. And I shamelessly teach it because it is so daggone useful. The book is called Just Enough Structured Analysis by Edward Jordan. It's free. I'll put a link to it in the Blackboard for you. So for people who want more, I also put a book chapter out. It's one of the editor-proof copies, but I don't want you to have to buy a book for just one chapter. So it's from a book that's used elsewhere in the curriculum, but it goes over both the process flow and the data flow stuff. So for those that want the text there. So there are data flow diagrams, like workflow diagrams, can be shown at multiple levels of detail, like the one with the research one, identify data, process data, make some reports, analyze it. That was one of those high-level workflow diagrams. A high-level data flow diagram is called a context diagram, and it sort of looks like this. There are three symbols on data flow diagrams, and so the ones with the open ends. And let me see if I've got. There we go. This will help. The boxes, the closed boxes on a data flow diagrams are entities, like things, entities, organizations, people, objects. What goes in an entity box should be a noun. Then there are processes that go in the circles. For example, if we're going to impute data for missing fields, impute, y'all know what that means? It's where if you have blank fields, blank dates, you're going to put an average date in there or something. So if you're doing some kind of process, you're going to put it in a circle. Again, our third use of the circle shape. The flows in data flow diagrams are curved arrows. So like you could tell immediately if somebody puts something on the table in front of you, whether it's a flow chart or a data flow, because of the curved lines in it. Data stores, whereas they look like a tuna can in the ISO 5807 flow charts, they're an open-ended box in data flow. And they do use terminators in data flow. It depends on the detail level at which you're doing the diagram. So the first one, this is what we call a context diagram. And what we mean by context diagram is the interface between a particular system and the rest of the world, which is really, really important for letting you know where data are coming from and where data are going to. When you design a system or specify one, that's the first thing you need to know. And so if our process is in the middle is the process of running a private practice in patient care and managing the data for that private practice, we're going to have patients from which we receive data and to which we give data. We're going to have payers from which we receive data, claims, acceptance, or denials, and to which we give data, our claim forms. We have pharmacies where we might send e-prescriptions and from which we might get refill requests from them. We might have pharmaceutical companies from which we receive safety alerts if we're a site in clinical investigation, and to whom we may send MedWatch forms or adverse drug effects that we find. On the EMR side, we might send it to an electronic medical record that's part of a larger integrated delivery system if we exist in one of those. We might send out e-prescription information to a commercial vendor or something, or we might store them. Then we may do public health reporting. If somebody's got a reportable condition, by law we got to do that, and we got to send immunizations and stuff like that. So there's that interface that we might have. There may be an interface to a local hospital for continuity of care documents. It may be two ways, and there may be a two-way interface to a lab, a local lab, where we might send out samples, or we might send them an electronic thing that says, hey, samples in the box, send somebody to pick it up, and then we may expect data back in the system. So these are the generic kinds of interfaces that somebody in a clinic, private practice setting might have, and then the two data storage boxes, the electronic medical record, either a large one if they're part of a system, or their own little one in their system. Does that kind of make sense? Yes?
Why is the one between private practice and lab?
Oh, it's the software did it. So I wish there was a software that allowed you to do just the smooth curve lines, because that's what the formalism says. Unfortunately, depending on how you align the boxes, and I do these in PowerPoint, just because it's easily shareable. Easily shareable is much more valuable to me than beautiful, highly functional modeling software. Yeah, no, so if it weren't for the inadequacies of the software, it wouldn't. But that's what I want you to be thinking of when you draw the diagram, is exactly, this line looks different from the rest. What the hell did I communicate? And that's like key, because if you diverge from the formalism, that is exactly what happens. People think, oh, that one's different for some reason. Or if you use color indiscriminately, that exact same thing happens, which is why, and it sounds like I'm obsessive compulsive, like harping on it, but thank you, that is exactly right. So the context diagrams, they're the first thing that I draw. So for example, earlier this year, an investigator came down and she says, well, hey, I'm trying to get this thing licensed by the FDA, and can you guys manage the data? And I'm like, well, sure, send me a protocol. So she sent me the protocol. First thing we did is sit down, we did a context diagram of what data do we have coming in and what data need to go out, so that we understand how many data sources we're dealing with and how many data transfers we have to manage. So context diagrams are like exquisitely valuable in communicating and coming to consensus with people on the scope of a project. Because if you only have limited resources to do an implementation, you might say, well, geez, the public health system, they have a web-based interface where you can enter the immunizations. And if you don't have a high volume, then maybe you shouldn't have an electronic transfer. Maybe your first implementation needs to be just a manual thing. I would hate to see that, because the electronic is much better, but that's where you can start to have your scope decisions on what needs to be programmed and developed versus what should be manual maybe. So the data flow diagrams for system design and development they go a next level down, and they can have multiple levels of detail. So basically any circle on one of these diagrams can have a lower level of detail diagram behind it. Does that make sense? Because any level of circle is a process, and that process itself has entities and data stores and sub-processes that it uses. So any circle is a candidate. In that case, some people put numbers in the circles. If there's a sequence through the data flow diagram, which there often is, some people number the circles to communicate that. Then when you have your other pages of your more detailed levels, page 1 has the detail for circle 1 in it. Make sense? Okay. So we talked about the symbols for the Jordan diagrams. And the next slides are just details about them. So the entity box, it has to be named with a noun. Entities can send or consume information, and data can come to and from an entity only from a process. So in other words, if data are coming out of a database, those data are processed in some way, even if it is just an extraction or a simple select statement. That is a process that gets the data to the entity. So these little rules that go along with each of these really help you to make sure that your process flow is reflective of what you're trying to represent. Because it's when you start asking those questions, oh, well, here's an entity. Now, wait a minute, what data are coming from it and what data go to it? So that helps you, by virtue of drawing the diagrams, it helps you get more explicit and understand better what it is you're trying to represent. The process circles, usually a single word if you can do it. Sometimes you can't. They also, processes have inputs and outputs to them, because that's the definition of a process. It has an input and an output. The flow lines, they generally are named according to some description of what the flow is, because often if you have data early on in the system, the data are less processed. They are different in scope in some way than the same data further down in the system. And so the label on the flow line should give you some indication of like exactly what data. So for example, we're doing the study and Duke is a site in our study. And Duke is processing their own data. They're sending us de-identified data. So we would want to label that arrow de-identified data so that the IRB clearly understands we do not get PHI from Duke. And nor are we sending them PHI, because the arrow goes one way, not two ways. So that just those little distinctions make it very clear for people who need to make decisions, whether they're building the system or like an IRB that's making a decision on whether or not you can run the study as it's been proposed. The next is the data store. It's sort of, people use them more broadly, not just a database, but any kind of data at rest, even if you're just collecting files that people are sending you. These are also named with a noun. They can be computerized or non-computerized, although today mainly computerized. The important thing is that data stores are passive. Putting data into a data store requires a process. Taking it out requires a process. So things don't go from entities to data stores. It has to go through some process. And that rule helps you get more explicit about exactly what you're doing to the data as it goes from one to the other. Does that make sense? Okay. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Okay, so go back. So Sally says, go back to the context diagram. There we go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because, so in the middle, that's the private practice. So, well, but they also have to get it back, because when the patient comes next time, the physician wants to look at it. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yep, it can. It can be two ways. And those are the kind of things that you, if there's question about it, you want to put that in the label on the flow, on the line. Does that make sense? Want to go back? Okay. Mm-hmm, sure. So this one health system, it was actually in Cabarrus County, North Carolina. They did they're actually, the Health Alliance is the public health department there, which is kind of interesting because they do like a huge amount of the primary care in the region. And so they were doing some process re-engineering, and they had some really good examples on the web of using Jordan notation. So this is an example of one. They modified it and used processes for everything. I wouldn't recommend exactly doing that, but when you're in practice and somebody pulls out a diagram, sometimes if you think that if they looks like they've used the formalism perfectly, then you just might want to confirm this is Jordan or ISO 5807 or UML, and they'll say yes or no. It could be just serendipitous that half of it looks like it. if the symbols look different, like they've modified it in some way, then you have to have a discussion with them or look at their legend as to exactly what they meant, what all those symbols on the diagram mean. Because by virtue of having drawn it a certain way, made them different colors, making different kind of lines, they mean something by that. And we want to understand that. Like they've made the small dashed blue lines input and the big fat yellow ones output. So you really, if people don't use standard notation, you have to get down into the meaning of all the stuff on their diagram. It's a huge cause of developers developing systems that the user might have intended one way, but it got developed another way because there was ambiguity in how that was communicated. So it's just an example. Something that helps me remember how to do these is basically that you can't have black holes that are processes that have inputs but no outputs. So no black holes in the diagram. There has to be output of a process, and there has to be input of a process. If a process has outputs but no inputs, it's a miracle. You can't have miracles on your diagrams. It has to be. You might not have remembered it, you might not know about it, you might not have thought about it, but there is some input to a process that has an output. And your job as an analyst, as an informaticist, is to find it out and put it on the diagram. And you can't have mysteries, which are unlabeled flows and unlabeled processes. Everything on there has to be labeled. So these are questions to ask as you look at other people's diagrams, and they're questions that people will ask as they look at your diagrams. So this is just some quotes from Jordan from his book. And picking the detail level is really important, because the detail level that you choose has to be one that's going to be helpful to the task that you're trying to use a diagram for. So there may be reasons to make a very detailed one. There may be reasons to make something high level like a context diagram. And that is your choice as the designer to choose, and your responsibility really to choose the right detail level. So that's, and then so there's the last one that I mentioned, BPMN, or business process modeling notation. There's a way in BPMN to show information flow and data flow. And the reason why I show it to you is because you may see this formalism. There is a standard out there for it. It's unclear as to whether it's going to be widely used or not, which is why I don't spend a lot of time in it, because I really haven't seen it in the biomedical domain very much. But it, like the others, has some boxes that we all might notice. And all the boxes stand for different things in the notation. There are some commercial software packages that help you draw these, just like there are for some of the other diagramming things. And so if you see some, what I'm just trying to show is that you might see some, and it's really important to figure out what formalism it is, and BPMN's a likely culprit that you could see. And so basically it models both the data and the process flow, which is kind of cool because it maintains links between an information model and the artifacts, and it maintains links, or can maintain links, between process steps and information that's used or generated in those processes. Often if you're trying to work with a clinical specialty, for example, or some folks in a lab, and try and figure out what data they need to manage, a good way to do that is to diagram their workflow, and then for each process step, ask them, what data do you use and what data are generated in that step? And then by doing that for their whole process, you will come up with a comprehensive view of the data that are used in that particular domain. And so the symbols, the graphic elements on them, you have events, activities, and gateways. That's their terminology that they use, just like the other ones, some standard shapes. I'm not going to test you on BPMN just because I don't see a lot of folks using it in biomedicine. It's mainly just informational. And they also have different kinds of lines in it. The cool thing about BPMN is BPMN is used with simulations. So if you are looking at software to do discrete event simulations or queuing theory simulations, like a practice flow or flow through lab or whatever, BPMN is a likely culprit for that, because the simulation software, BPMN is explicit enough that the simulation software can consume BPMN, and that's how you tell the software what process to simulate and what the flow control is. So, so if you're doing that, if you end up doing that kind of work for a project or for a thesis or a dissertation, then you really might want to look at BPMN, even though it's not used a lot, but it's very good in that particular niche. Any questions? Okay. All right, guys. Have a good weekend. It is Thursday, I think. I do have your quiz ready for the computers and biomedicine content from Lawrence, and I'll try to get that up tonight for you, and it'll be due not this Sunday, but next Sunday, since I'm late getting it up. I don't want to short you on time for that, but so just to give you a heads up that will come up tonight, and I think that's it. We will do a flow chart. We'll do a lab I'll put some scenarios in text and then ask you questions about them, like how many process steps in the diagram, just to make sure that you get how to go from words to the explicitness of the diagram. So that will be the lab for the workflow, will be basically those questions on there. And I'll make it multiple attempt, so in case you don't get it right, or in case I'm fuzzy. Hopefully I won't be fuzzy in the way that I specify them, but this is particularly hard to lock it in enough so that there's not two correct answers or it's not a little fuzzy. So I'll give you multiple attempts, but as always, feel free to holler at me or bring it up in class if something doesn't look right when you take the quiz. Okay, guys, thank you, and have a good evening. Okay, I heard a ding, and I'm trying to find Blackboard. Hang on. Okay, hang on, guys, with questions. I'm coming. Okay. Oh, that was just saying goodbye. Okay. So Hoda, we had some one or two Bayes-like questions on other stuff. Since I gave, that's okay. Since we had so many examples that I handed out with the solutions, I didn't do a separate quiz for that. Do you want me to put some up there when I put the practice test up for the exam? Would that help? Is that what you're asking? Well, yeah, the reason why is so I've noticed that there's a lot of people with multiple attempts on the quizzes, and even though the quizzes are multiple attempts on them, the final exam is not. And I'm afraid that people are taking it once, using the quiz as, oh, this is what's going to be asked, and going into those specific issues to ferret them out. And so I want you to have practice taking one without doing that, because I don't want folks to be surprised or to be totally new. I kind of see a pattern in the data, and I want to give you guys every possible chance to be successful. The questions will be at the same cognitive level, so they won't be a ton easier on the exam. They're multiple choice, but they're going to be application questions where you're going to have to apply knowledge. So they'll be at the same cognitive level, but you're not going to get multiple attempts. So yes, I'm going to put a practice up. Yes. So you can. So you can come take it in here. You can do it at home online. I will be doing it timed, but it won't be closely timed. And I do have at least one person that had a reason to need extra time in the allotment, so that will happen for that person as well. But you can take it in here, or you can take it online, either way. Okay, so Mitra, class project. Yes, so class project is turned in as a poster session. So you can feel free to put it in a discussion forum on Blackboard, but really what I care about is you in the poster session with your beautiful poster, getting the experience of presenting it. So you don't have to turn it in sooner, just show up with it on December 8th, and I will go around and grade them on December 8th. I won't put your grade up there in public, but it'll be in Blackboard for you. Yes, so that is your project, is the poster session. So remember, you have these things you're supposed to cover on the poster for your project, and so that is turning it in, is presenting that in the poster session. And remember, it's in the syllabus, and it was on the slides. You do not have to have a beautiful one printed that costs $100. You can put sheets of 8.5 by 11 paper, and that is completely fine. I don't want anybody to spend $100 getting a poster printed for this class. Send your poster with a friend to put your poster up, and and make sure your poster is good, because your poster needs to speak for itself. Nah, just make it good, but send it with a friend and make sure your friend hangs it up for you, and make sure that it's, yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, thanks guys. Let's see, final deliverable. So whoever asked about the final deliverable for the project rotation, I do not know when Lawrence's projects are due for that class. So that you'll have to ask Lawrence. Sorry. Oh, Thanksgiving, Mitra says. Okay, great. Okay, guys. Have a good afternoon.